Okay, so now in Chapter 7, what we have is sort of an understanding of the relationship between the unemployment rate and the wage and the overall price level. And so what we want to do is put them together into a macroeconomic model of the unemployment rate and how that's related to the price level. So in order to do that, we need to make a few more steps and a few more assumptions. So the first assumption is going to be that we get our expectations of the price level correct, so that the wage depends on the actual price level and not the expected price level. And that's going to be important because in our price determination equation, we didn't have the expected price level, we had the actual price level. That's a fairly minor assumption, especially these days when we don't get a lot of unexpected inflation. But obviously unexpected inflation is going to affect that. So this means that when the unemployment rate goes up, we have a lower real wage, and when the unemployment rate goes down, we have a higher real wage. And we call this the wage setting relation, and we're going to graph basically the wage against the unemployment rate. In order to determine the actual unemployment rate, we need to go back to our price setting equation. So now remember, our price setting equation was that P is equal to 1 plus the markup times the wage. So all we do here in equation 7.5 is divide both sides by the wage, and we get price divided by wage is equal to 1 plus the markup. Now the problem here is that we've got the opposite of the real wage, right? We've got P over W instead of W over P. So what we need to do is just invert both sides, and then that gives us W over P. That is our real wage. And then we get 1 over 1 plus M. So remember, M is the markup. M is going to be something like 10 or 20 or 30%. It's the cost above your marginal cost that firms are able to charge. Now the markup's important in the economy. Basically it gives you sort of the level of overall competition. When competition is fierce, the markup is low. And so when the markup is going down, right, that's in the denominator, and so the real wage is actually going to be going up. And when the markup is high, when there's less competition, that's going to mean that the real wage is going down. Now, the interesting thing is that this is the real wage, right? And so what we're interested in is how much the wage can actually buy things. With less competition, you might have a high nominal wage, but the prices are going to be high, right? Because the markup is high. And so your real wage will actually be low, whereas the opposite is true when there's a lot of competition. The nominal wage might not seem high, but the prices will be so low that the real wage will actually be higher. And so price setting decisions, these are going to determine the real wage paid by firms. And look, there's no unemployment rate here, right? So this is going to be interesting. This is just going to give us a horizontal line, as we'll see. And then where the two meet is really we just set the two equal, right? So we have the real wage is equal to our function of the unemployment rate in Z, and then we have the real wage is equal to 1 over 1 plus M. We set the two equal, and then the unemployment rate that meets that criterion is what we call the natural rate of unemployment. And what we'll see in a couple chapters is that this is the unemployment rate that is consistent with sort of constant inflation, right? No change in inflation. Inflation isn't going up or down. One thing to note, so this is obviously a very important unemployment rate, and you can kind of think of it as like an average unemployment rate over sort of the business cycle, or maybe the minimum unemployment rate, depending on what's going on with inflation. It's going to depend on the markup, so that's important. So as we can sort of see what will happen as the markup changes when we graph it. And it's going to depend on Z. And Z are all those sort of labor market institutions and rules that are going to affect the unemployment rate. So we call this the natural rate of unemployment, or maybe the structural rate of unemployment. And there's really, there's some debate about whether or not this is a good concept. And so we can talk about that. I think one danger is that when, you accept this argument, then as the unemployment rate goes down in an expansion, the central bank may feel like they have to start raising interest rates in order to check off inflation even before they see inflation. And so we'll talk about that some more. So here's our graph. Now, as I said, the price setting relationship is just 1 over 1 plus m. There's nothing in the unemployment rate, right? So we have our unemployment rate here on the horizontal axis. We have the real wage here on the vertical axis. And our price setting relation completely determines the real wage. Our wage setting relation does depend on the unemployment rate, right? And so when the unemployment rate is really low, the wage setting relation is high, and when the unemployment rate is really high, the wage setting relationship is low. Now remember, we're in the medium run here, right? So there's nothing that says we can't have a low unemployment rate and a high unemployment rate in the short run, but in the medium run, whatever that means, we should be here at point A at the natural unemployment rate where the real wage is equal to 1 over 1 plus m. Now, that real wage, that actual number, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's not something you would necessarily solve for. Again, this is a model that's going to allow us to think about what happens when something shifts, right? So when either the wage setting relation shifts or the price setting relation shifts. And the price setting relation is only going to shift when m changes, right? Because that's the only variable in that relationship. So when m goes down, the real wage is going to go up. We're going to shift up, and we'll have a lower natural rate of unemployment. So this is interesting because this implies that more competition will actually reduce the natural rate of unemployment. And then less competition, when m goes up, that's going to shift it down, and so we'll have a higher natural rate of unemployment. We can also see what's going to happen, if we shift our WS curve. And so the WS curve can shift because of Z, really, right? That's what our sort of catch-all variable is, but we have to think about what's going on. So this example is about unemployment benefits. So the idea is, all right, I increase unemployment benefits. That sort of increases workers' bargaining power. That shifts the wage setting curve to the right and actually doesn't change the wage at all because the wage is completely determined by the markup, but just increases the natural rate of unemployment. So there's some argument to be made, for example, that some European countries that have higher unemployment benefits end up with a higher unemployment rate, natural unemployment rate than countries like the United States that maybe have less generous unemployment benefits. Okay, maybe that, I think, it's not going to be this huge jump, right? It might be a couple percentage points, but at most. But we can talk about that. We can look at some of the data as well. And then, as we said, shifting the price setting curve is going to change the real wage, which will then also change the natural rate of unemployment. So an increase in the markup, which would be because of less competition in the economy, will shift the price setting curve down, increase the natural rate of unemployment, and have a lower real wage. And so that's something you definitely don't want to do. So let's look at the data here. So we've got the unemployment rate in red on the right, and we've got corporate profits before tax on the left. So why profits? Well, the markup is basically a measure of profits, right? And so this would say that when profits are high, the unemployment rate should be high, and when profits are low, when the markup is lower, the unemployment rate should be lower. I think we see that somewhat, maybe, but not necessarily clearly, right? These are sort of dominated by short-run fluctuations, right? The unemployment rate is dominated by short-run fluctuations. The economists do, then the BLS does a measure of the natural rate of unemployment, but it's really just a weighted average. I don't really trust it. I don't think it's measuring what it thinks it's measuring. We can also do a scatter plot. So this is a scatter plot of corporate profits and the unemployment rate. And so you can see there's not a lot of explanatory power there. Maybe a little bit that says, it's downward sloping, so a higher unemployment rate leads to lower profits, and a lower unemployment rate leads to higher profits, or the other way around, right? These are just correlations. So not necessarily supporting this model completely well. All right, so we're almost done with Chapter 7. The last video in Chapter 7 is just looking at the appendix and sort of looking at a different way to look at the labor market. So far, we've assumed that the price level is equal to the expected price level. And one of the things that we want to allow in the medium run is for those two not to be equal, because the price level can change when there are changes to the labor market, right? And so if people are setting wages and prices based on their expectations, and then either demand is higher than expected or lower than expected, then the ending price level is going to be different than expected price. So in the medium run, we would expect, sort of firms and wages to adjust their prices, and that's what we'll do in Chapter 8, right? Is that we will relax that assumption, and we'll start looking at, an expected price level that might not be the same as the ending price level.